Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing the things to do in the garden in September. Starting with flowers. Now, September is a huge month for setting yourself up for what you're going to need for next season in the spring. So it'll be a case of saving your seeds, taking your cuttings, splitting your perennials, all to create more plants for next season in the spring. September is a good month because it's still warm from the summer. The soil will still be warm, so we'll still germinate a few things and help roots to grow, but it'll be hopefully giving them enough time to settle in before the winter months and the cooler months come in. There are many different ways that you can save your seeds. Certain things will be in pods and will need to be removed from those. Generally, after a plant has flowered, the seeds will be on the flower head. Now, it's a very wet climate here in Ireland, so I like to try and remove those dead flower heads and those seed heads and put them somewhere dry where they can fully dry out before I store them. It's important to make sure you label what those things are, as they can look very different in seed form or from seed pod form than they did when they were flowering. So it can be difficult to identify some of them more than others. I like to put them on trays or plates or something to help dry them out. And then once they're fully dry, put them into envelopes or seed packets and make sure they're labelled with the year that they went to seed and what variety of flower or plant it is. You can lift and divide clumps of perennials such as crocosmia, euphorbias and delphiniums. This will give you more plants for the next season. Any of your tender perennials, if they're in pots, will need to be brought indoors before those temperatures start to drop so that they survive the winter. You can also take cuttings from things like fuchsias, salvias and pelargoniums. These again should have enough time to root before the winter months come in and should help you create new plants for the next season. As well as saving seeds from deadheading your flowers, you can also make sure to cut back any dead leaves or any branches that might be dying off. This will just help to prevent any fungal diseases from spreading in those areas and just help keep the areas around those plants clean and tidy. We can plant out some of our autumn flowering plants such as cyclamen, heathers and heucheras. These will give us a little bit of colour over those cooler months. Late flowering perennials such as sedum are great for the pollinators, giving them that last little bit of pollen before the winter starts to set in. You can start planting spring bedding plants such as pansies, wallflowers and forget-me-nots, and your spring bulbs as well, like crocuses, daffodils, hyacinths and bluebells can also be planted in September. We can trim back a bit of our privet and our conifer hedging if that is in need of a bit of a trim. Now, September is a time of year when the nesting birds are definitely no longer in the hedges, so I'm sure they probably need a bit of a trim back at this point of the year and just keep them tidy and ready for the winter. As well as saving your seeds, you can always leave some seed heads on your plants. These are great for the birds in the winter, things like sunflowers and teasel. Teasel is a particular favourite of goldfinch, so they're a great source of food for the birds coming into those cooler months, and it's great to see them being used not only by us but by the animals and birds as well. You can also lift, dry and store your gladioli corms once they have finished flowering as well. Moving on to our fruits and vegetables. Things you can sow that will be hardy throughout the winter include kale, pak choi and mizuna, and if you're wanting an early spring harvest, things like broad beans and peas can also be sown in September. You can pot up herbs that have been growing outdoors such as chives and parsley. You can pot them up and bring them indoors for winter harvests. You can start planting out shallot and onion sets in September. These will give you an early harvest next year. Garlic can probably wait until next month as it does need the frost so you're going to want to plant that a little bit later in the season. But onion sets and shallot sets can go in the ground now. Cut away any leaves on your squash and your pumpkin plants around the fruit. This will help it to ripen in time before you harvest it and bring out those wonderful colours and patterns on the fruit. Make sure to try and pick any apples or pears that are on your fruit trees before the wind blows them down. The windfall fruit isn't usually too bad, but it can certainly be eaten more by birds and wasps that can be a real nuisance. As you're storing your pears and your apples, you don't want them to be touching each other, especially if there might be one that can be infected. That will spread throughout your crop, so make sure that the apples and pears, when you're storing them, are not touching each other. Lots of harvesting in September, as well as your apples and your pears. You can start to harvest things like your chilies. These also will need to be dried and stored, or you can blend them up to be chili flakes. You can lift your main crop of potatoes and store those. There are multiple ways that potatoes can be stored. Usually, to be honest, ours don't last that long. But as long as they are stored in a cool, dark, well-ventilated place, they will last throughout the winter for you. You can also harvest sweet corn, onions, blackberries, French and runner bean, and your autumn raspberries. The stems from the summer raspberries can be cut down back to the ground now, the woody stems, so that it can encourage the new growth for next year. Root crops such as carrots, beetroots, parsnips and turnips can be stored in the ground over winter, so there's no need to lift them until you need to use them. As we come into September, it can become a bit more wet with more rain on the way and those early frosts as well. So we can reduce our watering and our feeding of most of our fruits and vegetables, including tomatoes, aubergines and cucumbers. Moving on to our general maintenance, we can remove any shading that we have put over our polytunnels and our greenhouses. The fruits and vegetables in those are going to need as much of the dwindling sunlight as possible, as we're coming into those days that don't have quite so much sun in them. When it comes to ventilating these areas as well, you potentially are going to want to close any doors and vents as the evenings are getting cooler and the potential for frost is getting higher. We can use September to aerate any of our lawns and well-trodden grassy patches. We can do this with a fork, or there are multiple tools that can be used, or machinery that can be used to aerate lawns. This means that we can reseed those bare areas to encourage airflow in those lawns and encourage the grass to grow better next year. As leaves are starting to fall off some of our trees, you're going to want to cover any ponds with netting to prevent debris and leaves from getting into your ponds. Also remove any blanket weed or algae as well. You're also going to want to clean out any guttering or downpipes from any fallen leaves that might have collected there, so that when it rains there's no blockages throughout those systems. Mind you, these falling leaves do come in very useful. You can collect up fallen leaves and add them to your compost, which is a great addition to it, or you can use them as a mulch on your plants. Just be mindful of where the falling leaves are coming from, which plants they could be coming from. If the leaves look like they have been infected by black spot or brown rot, you're not going to want to put these on your compost, as the spores on those leaves could potentially infect other plants if you spread them on as a mulch or use them as a compost. So it's better just to remove them from your site completely, so that prevents the spread of those fungal diseases. You can wash out and disinfect any bird baths and bird feeders. As we head into the autumn, the weather could potentially change to more stormy and potentially very windy conditions. So you're going to want to double check your tree ties and your plant supports for those taller plants to make sure that they are secure. September is a good time to order your bare root fruit trees for autumn or winter planting. As the season is starting to slow down, we can give our greenhouses and polytunnels and some of our beds and outdoor spaces a bit more of a clean and a tidy. Autumn is a very slow time of year. Everything's kind of coming to its end, and it's just nice to kind of get everything tidied up before the winter, before the season really closes down, and just get those areas prepared for the spring again. So if you get a chance, tidying up those areas and keeping them clean and tidy and free of debris over the winter will just set you up nicely for the spring season. With our houseplants, we can water and feed less frequently now that the sunlight hours are dwindling and the temperatures are reducing. You can move some of your plants off windowsills that could potentially get cold. You're going to want to move them a bit further into rooms and not be quite so exposed on those windowsills. Same with any houseplants that you may have put outside during the summer, they can now be brought back indoors. Don't forget to keep those leaves clean, check for pests and diseases, and just generally keep your houseplant areas tidy and free of dead leaves and debris. Having a look in the apiary now, we're moving on to the beekeeping. You're going to want to assess the weight of the stores in your colonies. Now that means you're going to have to heft the hives. Now your honey crop has been removed. You want to make sure that the colony has enough stores in the hive to survive the winter. This could mean giving them a feed. In the winter, the feed is usually 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. There are also fondants that you can feed them as well, but the sugar to water ratio is usually quicker for them to put into their stores than the fondant, which they would need to break down. The ivy will be starting to flower in September, but you shouldn't rely on the pollen from the ivy to be filling the stores of your hives. So do make sure that you keep an eye on the weight of your hives and heft them regularly enough to know that your colonies will have sufficient stores to survive the winter. You may start to notice that the larger male bees, the drones, will be seen more outside of the hives than inside the hives. This is because around this time of year, the female workers will start to evict the male drones from the hives. The drones would have served their purpose for the colony. They are no longer needed for mating. So they will actually be just a drain on the resources and the stores over the winter. Obviously they're bigger bees, they would take more stores. So they are evicted, sometimes quite violently, from the hive by the worker bees around this time of year. So it is a girls only colony throughout the winter. This is to ensure that the queen survives, that the eggs are taken care of, and that the colony in general survives over the winter, ready to start the process all again in the spring. That's it for this month's video. I hope you have managed to get a bountiful harvest from your gardens, enjoyed all your flowers, which are now kind of ending their season, and enjoy the last of the lovely evenings and the sunny days that we'll be having in the garden before we settle in for the autumn and winter months. So thanks so much for coming by. I hope to see you again for October's video, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.